What if I told you that for almost 20 years, the U.S. Navy's encrypted secrets, submarine routes, battle plans, and top-level codes were flowing straight into the hands of the Soviet Union? Not because of a daring break-in or some high-tech hack, but because one man in uniform quietly sold them out for cash. His name was John Anthony Walker, and his betrayal built one of the most dangerous spy rings of the Cold War. Before we dive in, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our future deep dive documentaries into espionage, betrayal, and covert history. And if you know someone who loves spy thrillers, share this with them. It helps our community grow. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments. What's the last spy documentary or thriller you watched before this one? I'm curious to see what stories gripped you most before you pressed play on this one. All right, let's step into the shadows and follow the trail of the man who sold the Navy's secrets for cash. The story doesn't open with gunfire or explosions. It opens with silence. An ordinary spring evening in 1967 in a nondescript parking lot in Washington, D.C. A man in a Navy uniform grips a plain envelope, his knuckles white, his heartbeat louder than the passing traffic. Inside the envelope are Navy cryptographic codes, lifelines of American military communication. The man's name is John Anthony Walker, Jr. By day, he's a trusted chief warrant officer in the U.S. Navy. By night, he's about to become the most devastating mole in American naval history. There's no dramatic recruitment speech, no Soviet officer sliding a dossier across a dimly lit table. Walker recruits himself. He's broke. His marriage is collapsing. He drowns his debts in cheap whiskey and half-baked excuses. But then he sees the one thing that could fix his mess: the Navy's secrets. In Walker's mind, they aren't sacred. They're currency. And somewhere in the shadows, the Soviet Union is always buying. He walks briskly to the Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue, clutching the envelope as though it were a lifeline. The Cold War is at fever pitch. Vietnam bleeds on, Moscow and Washington measure each other's every move, and nuclear arsenals grow fat with warheads. Yet no one inside the embassy expects the knock that night. Walker, in his starched navy whites, asks to speak with someone who can make use of important information. It's the kind of line that could have been lifted straight from a spy novel, but it is chillingly real. The Soviets are cautious at first. They've seen walk-ins before. Sometimes it's bait, sometimes a drunk, sometimes a lunatic. But Walker's envelope is different. Inside are key cards for the Navy's KW-7 encryption system, the backbone of U.S. naval communications. It's like handing over the master key to a vault, except this vault guards not gold, but the movements of aircraft carriers, submarines, and ballistic missiles. For the KGB Residentura in Washington, this is not a gift. It's a miracle. They test him quickly. Can he keep secrets? Can he deliver consistently? Walker doesn't hesitate. He has tasted the intoxicating rush of betrayal. The Soviets pay him a modest sum, just enough to cover debts, but they promise more, much more. What began as desperation will become an empire of espionage. Back in his home in suburban Maryland, Walker slips back into his routine. He tucks his Navy cap on the rack, kisses his children goodnight, and pretends to be the faithful officer. No one suspects a thing. Not his fellow sailors, not his commanding officers, not even his wife Barbara, who at this point still thinks his late nights are just Navy work. The duplicity is seamless. The uniform hides everything. But the stakes, they are astronomical. Within months, Moscow has a window into the very heartbeat of the U.S. Navy. Every message scrambled, every transmission relayed, every order whispered across the seas, decoded and read in real time by Soviet ears. The imbalance of power shifts, not with the detonation of a bomb, but with the silent pass of paper across a table. Walker is emboldened. He doesn't just deliver codes, he creates a system, a pipeline. He knows when the Navy rotates ciphers, when machines are upgraded, when manuals are replaced. Every time the Americans change the lock, Walker slips the Soviets a new key. And all the while, he continues to climb the Navy ranks, the very institution he is dismantling from within. The audacity is breathtaking. The Navy is paranoid about Soviet submarines shadowing its ballistic fleet, but it never imagines that the enemy already knows exactly where those subs are headed, because one of their own officers is feeding the information straight to Moscow. But Walker is not content with being a lone mole. The deeper he sinks, the greedier he gets. He wants more money, more control, more reach, and he realizes something. To keep this machine running, he needs more than his own access. He needs a ring. The Soviet handlers encourage it. Recruit family, recruit friends, recruit anyone who can provide access. A single mole is valuable. A network is priceless. And so, with a cold pragmatism that chills even seasoned spies, John Walker decides to drag others into his betrayal. The web of treachery will soon ensnare his brother, his son, even his closest friend. But that comes later. For now, the seed is planted in 1967, the seed of America's most devastating naval betrayal. And the Soviets? They are patient, calculating, and ruthless. They know what they've been handed is not just an asset, it's a weapon. While the Americans still bask in the illusion of security, Moscow begins quietly plotting moves across oceans and decades, confident that a uniformed traitor will keep them one step ahead. The knock on the embassy door that night seemed insignificant. Just another man with troubles. But in truth, it was an earthquake in disguise, and its shockwaves would ripple through the Cold War for nearly 2 decades. Walker doesn't know it yet, but he has just crossed a line he can never retreat from. Every secret sold tightens the noose around his neck. Every envelope exchanged binds him closer to the KGB. And though he feels untouchable, invincible, the reality is stark. The more powerful his betrayal becomes, the more inevitable his downfall. For now, however, he is untouchable. For now, he is invisible. For now, John Walker is the KGB's most valuable American spy. And no one in the U.S. Navy suspects a thing. The 1970s were supposed to be a decade of détente, a cooling of Cold War tensions. But inside the shadows, John Walker was doing the opposite. His quiet betrayal was expanding, multiplying, tightening into a ring of treachery that would compromise nearly every corner of the U.S. Navy. It began with a simple realization: Walker couldn't keep up with demand alone. The Soviets were hungry, insatiable. Once you gave them a taste of American cryptographic blood, they wanted more. Constantly updated codes, operating manuals, and communication schedules. One man's clearance, no matter how high, was never enough. And Walker knew just the people to bring in: family, friends, blood ties, and bonds of loyalty, the kind of connections no counterintelligence officer would suspect. The first to fall into his orbit was his brother, Arthur Walker. Arthur was a Navy veteran turned defense contractor, with easy access to classified documents through his civilian job. To John, his brother wasn't just kin, he was a perfect tool. "Do this, and we both make money," John told him, framing espionage not as betrayal, but as business. Arthur hesitated, unnerved by the prospect of spying, but blood is persuasive. And John was relentless. Soon enough, Arthur was quietly ferrying sensitive documents into his brother's hands. But Walker's most audacious recruitment came next: his best friend, Jerry Whitworth. Whitworth was more than a friend. He was a trusted Navy radio man, a man who worked directly with the cryptographic systems Walker was selling. Whitworth had the kind of access most spies could only dream of. With him inside the circle, Walker's value to the Soviets would skyrocket. Whitworth resisted at first. He had no debts, no desperate need for cash, but Walker knew his weaknesses: loneliness, a thirst for belonging, a soft spot for John's manipulative charm. Walker dangled money and camaraderie like bait. Eventually, Whitworth cracked. By the mid-1970s, he was funneling classified cryptographic key lists and codes to Walker, who in turn delivered them straight into Soviet hands. With Arthur and Whitworth on board, the Walker ring was no longer just one man, it was a machine. And the Soviets loved it. With their help, Moscow could read almost every single U.S. Navy message in real time. It was like sitting inside the Pentagon's war room, invisible and uninvited. But John Walker wasn't finished. His greed and his arrogance pushed him further. He decided to recruit someone who had the deepest kind of loyalty, his own son. Michael Walker, barely out of high school, followed his father into the Navy in the late 1970s. For John, it was an irresistible opportunity. Why rely only on friends and brothers when your own flesh and blood could be turned into a source? He handed Michael tasks, groomed him into secrecy, and slowly pulled him into the same dark current that had swallowed him years earlier. Michael would later provide his father with information straight from his shipboard assignments, another artery pumping intelligence to Moscow. Each recruitment expanded the web. Each member gave Walker another layer of access. By the end of the decade, the Soviets weren't just receiving scraps, they were feasting. Codebooks, keycards, encryption schedules, tactical manuals, anything Walker or his circle could get their hands on. The KGB residentura in Washington was so overwhelmed with data that they sometimes struggled to process it all. The U.S. Navy remained blind. To them, Walker was still the dependable officer, the brother, the father, the friend. No one suspected that beneath the surface, he had built the most damaging spy ring in naval history. What made Walker's ring so effective wasn't just access, it was continuity. American cryptographic systems changed regularly, but Walker and his team ensured that Moscow always had the newest keys, the latest codes. The Soviets didn't just break one lock, they owned the entire locksmith shop. The cost was devastating. Soviet submarines could shadow American ballistic missile subs with eerie precision. Naval exercises meant to project strength were read like open books, even contingency war plans. The scenarios for nuclear conflict were exposed to Moscow. In the event of a shooting war, U.S. sailors would have been walking blind while the Soviets maneuvered with perfect clarity. And yet, for all the damage, Walker treated it like a family business. He paid his son, his brother, his friend. He kept everyone hooked with money and loyalty. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Whitworth, racked with guilt, began writing anonymous letters to the FBI, half-confessions that hinted at the existence of a spy ring. Arthur grew uneasy. Michael, young and reckless, wasn't as careful as his father. And John himself? He was becoming careless, overconfident, convinced of his invincibility. The 1970s had transformed John Walker from a lone traitor into the architect of a spy empire. But empires built on betrayal have short lifespans. And the cracks he ignored in this decade would be the fault lines of his eventual destruction in the next. For now, though, the Walker ring was untouchable. The Soviets called him the jewel in the crown. And the U.S. Navy had no idea that its most trusted officer was systematically handing their secrets to the enemy. Secrets that could have decided the fate of the Cold War itself. And somewhere in Moscow, KGB officers raised a quiet toast. America had its aircraft carriers, its submarines, its nuclear warheads. But the Soviets had John Walker, and that was worth more than an entire fleet. It was the perfect crime, hidden in plain sight. While America armed itself to the teeth in a Cold War staring contest with the Soviet Union, one man, sitting comfortably in a Navy uniform, was feeding Moscow a steady diet of gold. The Soviets called it the Golden Stream. Not oil, not gold bullion, not technology, but secrets. A stream of American naval intelligence so rich, so precise, so devastating in scope that the KGB could hardly believe their luck. And at the center of it all stood John Anthony Walker, Jr., the Navy officer who had turned treason into a family business. By the late 1970s, Walker's ring was operating like a well-oiled machine. Each cog, his brother Arthur, his son Michael, his best friend Jerry Whitworth, fed him classified material. Manuals, codes, key lists, cipher updates, it was all carefully collected, packaged, and passed into Soviet hands. For Moscow, it was like being given the cheat codes to the U.S. Navy. For Walker, it was easy money. But the true scale of what the Soviets gained is almost impossible to overstate. Through Walker, they didn't just read American messages, they lived inside them. Every fleet movement, every submarine patrol, every nuclear readiness drill laid bare for Soviet planners in real time. Take the ballistic missile submarines, the crown jewels of America's nuclear deterrent. These were supposed to be invisible, prowling silently under the oceans, ready to launch a counterstrike in the event of nuclear war. But, thanks to Walker's cryptographic leaks, the Soviets could track them like fishermen reading a tide chart. Submarines that were meant to vanish beneath the waves now left paper trails straight to Moscow. Or consider fleet exercises. When the U.S. Navy practiced large-scale maneuvers, projecting power across the Atlantic and Pacific, the Soviets were already waiting. They knew where ships would be, when communications would shift, how squadrons would move. Soviet admirals could shadow U.S. carriers, run mock counters, and calibrate their entire naval strategy with uncanny accuracy. It was espionage on an industrial scale. The KGB didn't just receive intelligence, they received a real-time window into America's most guarded military branch. And it went on for years. Inside the Soviet residentura in Washington, Walker's deliveries became routine. Drop sites were arranged, cash was exchanged, secrets moved across borders. KGB officers joked that their American source was more reliable than their own Soviet engineers. When Moscow's intelligence reports hit the desks of senior Politburo members, many were stamped with the same origin, Walker's stream. But the Soviets weren't laughing. They were planning. Armed with Walker's intelligence, Moscow fine-tuned its submarine tactics, perfected its missile strategies, and recalibrated its nuclear posture. The balance of naval power shifted in subtle but profound ways. The U.S. thought it had the upper hand at sea, but in reality, the Soviets were matching their every move, often one step ahead. And yet, the Americans had no clue. No alarms rang at the Pentagon. No suspicion clouded Walker's career. He was still the dependable warrant officer, still the father raising kids in suburban Maryland, still the friend and brother who seemed ordinary. His greatest trick was blending in. He wasn't James Bond. He wasn't a flamboyant traitor. He was a bureaucrat with access, and that was far more dangerous. What made the Golden Stream so extraordinary was its continuity. Espionage usually comes in bursts. An agent hands over a file, a mole steals a document, then the pipeline dries up. But with Walker, the Soviets had a faucet that never turned off. Every time codes rotated, Whitworth supplied new ones. Every time manuals updated, Arthur delivered copies. Every time Michael's ship received new instructions, Walker collected them. The result? Moscow could intercept and decrypt American naval communications for nearly 2 decades straight. Imagine reading your opponent's playbook in a championship game, not once, but every single quarter, every season, for years. That was the advantage Walker gave the Soviets. To them, he was a legend. In Moscow, Walker's codename was whispered with reverence. Soviet admirals toasted him in private. KGB analysts boasted about the clarity of their reports. One internal KGB memo described Walker's material as the most important in the history of Soviet intelligence. But while Moscow thrived, cracks began to spread back in the States. Walker's personal life was unraveling. His marriage had long since collapsed under the weight of lies and paranoia. His ex-wife Barbara knew enough to be dangerous. She suspected what he was doing, and her bitterness festered. His relationship with his children was strained, poisoned by the toxic mix of manipulation and betrayal. Michael, his son, had joined the Navy, but Walker's grooming of him as a spy blurred the line between fatherhood and exploitation. And Whitworth? Guilt gnawed at him. Unlike Walker, who seemed immune to conscience, Whitworth felt the weight of what they were doing. He drank heavily, wrestled with depression, and at times hinted at confession. In anonymous letters to the FBI, Whitworth would pour out fragments of truth, half warnings, half cries for help. But without specifics, the Bureau dismissed them. The ring remained invisible. As the 1980s dawned, the Golden Stream continued to flow. the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the renewed arms race, the election of Ronald Reagan. Through it all, Walker kept his pipeline steady. If Reagan's rhetoric promised to stand tough against the evil empire, Moscow smirked quietly, because behind the curtain they already knew America's moves before America made them. Walker himself grew bolder. He flaunted his wealth, buying new cars, gambling recklessly, spending beyond his means. Yet, even when colleagues raised eyebrows, no one imagined espionage. They saw a Navy man enjoying perks, not a traitor bankrolled by the Kremlin. The irony is chilling. At the height of the Cold War, when Washington poured billions into weapon systems and surveillance, the Soviets didn't need to outspend America. They had Walker. A single man with a handful of accomplices gave them the edge of an entire fleet. The Golden Stream was more than just intelligence. It was a strategic equalizer. Without it, Soviet naval strategy might have collapsed under U.S. superiority. With it, Moscow stood toe-to-toe with the world's most powerful navy. And yet, every stream eventually runs dry. The very continuity that made Walker invaluable also made him vulnerable. For nearly 2 decades, he had spun his web without consequence. But every lie, every code, every envelope passed was another thread tightening around his neck. The Soviets toasted him. The Americans trusted him. But betrayal has a half-life. And by the early 1980s, the very ring Walker had built with such precision was beginning to turn against him. The Golden Stream was flowing stronger than ever. But so too was the suspicion gathering around him, suspicion that would eventually explode into one of the biggest counterintelligence scandals in U.S. history. For now, though, Moscow was drunk on secrets, and John Walker, warrant officer, father, traitor, was their golden fountain. The 1980s arrived like a drumbeat. Ronald Reagan thundered about the evil empire, promising to outspend, outarm, and outlast the Soviets in every domain. The arms race accelerated, technology leaped forward, and paranoia thickened in Washington like a fog. But in the shadows of the Cold War, a quieter story was unfolding, the slow, inevitable unraveling of the most damaging spy ring in U.S. naval history. John Walker, smug and overconfident, believed he was untouchable. For nearly 2 decades, he had been the Kremlin's golden boy, feeding them a river of secrets, while the Navy saluted him as a faithful officer. His arrogance had metastasized into carelessness. He bragged to girlfriends, flaunted cash, gambled recklessly, and convinced himself that the laws of gravity, of betrayal, would never apply to him. But betrayal corrodes not only institutions, it corrodes people. And now, his ring was beginning to crack under the pressure of its own corruption. The first and deepest crack appeared in Jerry Whitworth. Whitworth was not cut from the same cloth as John Walker. He didn't have the same steel stomach for treason, nor the same narcissism that shielded Walker from guilt. A Navy radio man by trade, Whitworth had access to some of the most sensitive cryptographic material the Navy possessed. He passed it to Walker faithfully for years, but it weighed on him. Each key list stolen, each code surrendered, gnawed at his conscience like acid dripping on steel. At night, Whitworth drank heavily to dull the guilt. He would sit alone in his apartment, chain-smoking, staring at classified documents he was about to betray, and ask himself why. Walker's answer was always money. "It's just business, Jerry." But Whitworth never felt like a businessman. He felt like a traitor. His soul was collapsing under the burden. By the mid-1980s, Whitworth began sending anonymous letters to the FBI. They weren't clean confessions. Whitworth was too terrified for that. But they were cries for help, vague hints about a spy ring inside the Navy, whispers of betrayal. The letters were incoherent, half-coded ramblings, unsigned and untraceable. To FBI analysts, they looked like the scribbles of a crank. But they weren't. They were the bleeding conscience of the Walker spy ring, trying desperately to surface. The Bureau filed them away, skeptical, unaware that buried in those letters was the trail to the most dangerous mole the Navy had ever harbored. Whitworth's guilt had cracked the ring, but no one recognized it yet. The second crack came from Barbara Walker, John's ex-wife. Barbara had lived with the lies for too long. She had seen the late-night absences, the unexplained money, the arrogance, the secrets that always seemed to hover in their home like ghosts. By the time their marriage disintegrated, Barbara was bitter, furious, and dangerously aware of what John was doing. She may not have had the full picture, but she had enough to be lethal. She knew he was betraying something sacred, and she knew he was dragging their family into it. Her anger grew with each passing year. She feared for her children, especially Michael, who had followed his father into the Navy. John wasn't just corrupting institutions, he was corrupting bloodlines. Barbara saw Michael's loyalty to his father as a kind of enslavement, and she resented it bitterly. John had manipulated his own son, feeding him into the machinery of espionage, poisoning his future. Barbara, cornered by rage and desperation, began to think about what no one else dared, exposing John. But to whom? The Navy, the FBI? Who would believe a scorned ex-wife? Worse, John Walker was still cunning enough to intimidate her. He would remind her coldly that if she talked, she would go down with him. The Soviets, the FBI, the Navy, none of them would spare her. For years, Barbara remained paralyzed, torn between fear and fury, but the cracks in her silence were forming, and eventually they would widen into a fissure that would swallow John whole. The third crack was Michael Walker and himself. Michael had been groomed from the beginning. His father dangled money, approval, and a twisted sense of family duty. Michael, young and impressionable, delivered classified material to his father, believing he was securing his place in John's world. But he was sloppy. He lacked his father's paranoia, his obsessive caution. Where John had been meticulous, Michael was reckless. He left trails. He bragged to friends. He failed to mask his movements. The KGB handlers noticed it first. They complained privately that Michael was too green, that his work was sloppy. John defended him, but deep down, he knew his son wasn't cut out for espionage. Yet, he kept using him anyway. Because for John Walker, loyalty wasn't about trust. It was about control. Michael was a pawn, a son bound to his father's treachery, whether he was capable or not. Each of these cracks, the guilt of Whitworth, the rage of Barbara, the recklessness of Michael, were invisible to the Navy. But they weren't invisible to fate. Slowly, inevitably, they widened, until they began to attract the gaze of those who mattered most, the FBI. The Bureau in the 1980s was growing more aggressive in counterintelligence. Reagan's America was determined to expose Soviet moles, to root out traitors before they could do irreversible damage. The ghosts of Aldrich Ames and others were still ahead, but the culture of suspicion was tightening. Analysts reviewed intercepted signals, vague tips, odd financial anomalies. And while John Walker wasn't yet on their radar, the ecosystem of paranoia was thickening. It was Barbara who finally lit the fuse. Her silence had become unbearable. Watching Michael follow his father's poisonous path pushed her over the edge. By 1984, she could no longer stay quiet. She reached out to the FBI, telling them in sharp, furious tones that her ex-husband was selling secrets to the Soviets. At first, agents listened politely, but skeptically. Ex-wives, they knew, could be vindictive. Accusations could be exaggerated or false altogether. But then Barbara began to provide details, specifics about John's access, his behavior, the money, the timing, details too precise to be dismissed as fantasy. For the FBI, the alarm finally went off. They opened a formal investigation into John Anthony Walker, Jr. The Bureau moved cautiously. Walker had been operating undetected for nearly 20 years. If they bungled this, he could vanish or destroy evidence. Surveillance teams were assigned. His movements were tracked. Drop sites were monitored. Slowly, the FBI began piecing together the puzzle, confirming that Barbara's accusations were not bitter lies, but chilling truth. Meanwhile, Whitworth's guilt metastasized into paranoia. His anonymous letters continued, now tinged with desperation. He hinted more directly at his role, even offering to trade information in exchange for immunity. The FBI, now primed by Barbara's tip, began to re-examine these letters with fresh eyes. The puzzle pieces started to align. Whitworth's confessions, Barbara's accusations, Michael's recklessness, all threads pointing to the same name, John Walker. But Walker remained oblivious. In his mind, he was still the untouchable mastermind. He believed his son was loyal, his friend Whitworth committed, his brother Arthur dependable. He believed Barbara was too broken and bitter to act. He believed the Soviets would protect him forever. What he didn't believe, what he could never bring himself to imagine, was that the walls were already closing in. The FBI tightened surveillance, watching Walker's every move. They saw him at drop sites, caught glimpses of exchanges, noted his paranoia when he checked his rearview mirror. They began to intercept communications, to analyze his contacts. And as the noose drew tighter, they saw clearly what he could not. The cracks in the ring had become fractures, and fractures always collapse. By 1985, the Walker spy ring was no longer a golden stream. It was a leaking dam, moments away from bursting. Whitworth's guilt had made him a liability. Barbara's betrayal had lit the FBI's fuse. Michael's recklessness had drawn attention. And John Walker, blinded by arrogance, was still strutting like a king in a palace made of sand. For nearly 2 decades, the Soviets had drunk from Walker's fountain of secrets. But fountains don't run forever. The golden stream was about to dry up, and when it did, the full weight of American justice would come crashing down. The cracks were widening. The FBI was watching. The ring was collapsing. And John Walker, Navy officer, traitor, architect of betrayal, was about to face the reckoning he never believed possible. The night was humid in Maryland, a quiet suburban stretch, broken only by the occasional rumble of a passing car and the faint rustle of tree branches against street lamps. But to the trained eyes of the FBI surveillance teams, tucked discreetly into vans and parked sedans, it was a night pulsing with the electricity of culmination. 2 decades of betrayal were about to collide with one night of reckoning. John Anthony Walker, Jr., the U.S. Navy warrant officer turned traitor, had been under the Bureau's microscope for months. Each movement tracked, each contact logged, each suspicious errand silently noted. And tonight, the net was drawing so tight that even Walker, cocksure, practiced, and arrogant, would have no room to wriggle free. The Bureau was ready to spring, and the KGB's golden spy would fall. The hunt had begun not in shadowy alleys or wiretapped hotel rooms, but in the fraying seams of Walker's personal life. Barbara Walker, his estranged wife, had been cracking for years under the weight of secrets whispered behind closed doors, and the inexplicable luxuries that never seemed to match John's military salary. She had kept silent during the marriage, too afraid, too emotionally battered, too tangled in his domineering presence. But as the years pressed on and John's paranoia grew sharper, Barbara had found her voice. In 1985, she picked up the phone and told the FBI something that would trigger the largest mole hunt the Bureau had ever launched inside the Navy. "My husband has been selling secrets to the Russians for years." The Bureau didn't laugh it off. They had learned from bitter experience, Ames, Hansen, Howard, that the whisper of betrayal could hide oceans of truth. At first, agents doubted whether a single disgruntled spouse could be believed, but the more they looked into Walker, the more the shape of his betrayal came into focus. His communications work in the Navy had given him access to cryptographic material, cipher keys that could open up entire channels of classified Navy communications. Suddenly, old Soviet successes made chilling sense, and so they began the careful work of surveillance. Walker had lived for years under the arrogant assumption that he could outwit any tale, that his methods were too ingrained, too professional to be penetrated. He had relied on dead drops, cutouts, and staggered meetings to keep himself insulated. But the Bureau was patient. They tracked his every step. They mapped his world. The net was tightening with every passing week. In April 1985, the FBI had Walker's son, Michael, under their gaze as well. Michael had become an accomplice, a courier who moved stolen documents into his father's hands. The Bureau kept close watch, but held back from immediate arrests. They wanted the entire ring, every conspirator, and above all, undeniable proof that Walker was still actively betraying his country. Surveillance cameras captured John Walker wandering shopping malls, paying for meals in cash, using payphones at odd hours, visiting obscure locations with no clear explanation. To the naked eye, it might have seemed random. To counterintelligence agents, it was choreography, the signature movements of a spy preparing a handoff. The FBI's special agent in charge of the operation, who had studied Walker's patterns for weeks, put it bluntly to his team, "We don't get many shots at a mole of this magnitude. He slips once, maybe twice, and if we miss, he disappears into Soviet hands. This ends now." The decision was made. They would catch Walker red-handed during a dead drop. The Russians had become used to Walker's reliability. He never failed to deliver, never faltered, never once raised their suspicions. If they were to seize him at the drop, the Soviets might even panic, convinced their prized source had been compromised. That panic was precisely what the Bureau needed. May 1985. The dead drop site chosen by Walker was in Rockville, Maryland. A wooded patch near a country road, seemingly ordinary but perfect for the quiet exchange of secrets. The Bureau began staging assets days in advance. Plainclothes agents posed as joggers, dog walkers, couples strolling in the evening air. Surveillance vans took up hidden positions, their cameras trained on the drop zone. From high-powered lenses to night vision optics, every angle of the site was covered. Helicopters waited on standby. Walker thought he was alone. In truth, he was surrounded. On May 20th, the night unfolded like the climax of a film. Walker, carrying a brown paper bag filled with highly classified material, drove towards the site. His car, a nondescript vehicle chosen for blending in, rolled slowly along the road before pulling over. The FBI surveillance units followed at a calculated distance, communicating in clipped, precise code over radios. The air inside the vans was thick with anticipation. Some agents had been on Walker for weeks without relief, sleeping in shifts, living on stale coffee and fast food, all for this moment. Walker parked, got out, and surveyed the area. He had the instincts of a spy, eyes darting, head turning, checking for tails. To him, the wooded area seemed silent. The suburban peace cloaked the trap that had been meticulously laid. He moved toward a designated spot beneath a bridge, where he intended to leave the documents for Soviet retrieval. The agents waited until the exact moment his hand left the package. That was the proof, the physical act of espionage, caught in real time. "Move! Move! Move!" crackled the command in FBI earpieces. Suddenly, the night exploded with motion. Agents in plain clothes surged from hidden positions. Black-clad operatives sprinted from the tree line. Vehicles roared forward, headlights blazing. Walker spun, startled, his eyes wide for the first time in years. He reached instinctively for the bag, as if clutching it could undo the betrayal of decades. But there was no escape. Guns drawn, agents encircled him in a ring of steel. "FBI, don't move!" For a heartbeat, Walker froze, caught between defiance and surrender. Then his shoulders slumped, and the weight of years seemed to drag him down. John Anthony Walker, Jr., the man who had sold his country for cash, who had opened America's naval codes to Moscow for nearly 2 decades, was finally in handcuffs. The scene was electric. Agents securing the package, confirming its contents, cipher cards, keying material, cryptographic instructions. The Soviets had been poised to receive another treasure trove. Instead, the evidence now lay in Bureau hands. The fallout began instantly. Michael Walker, already under suspicion, was picked up the same night. Arthur Walker and Jerry Whitworth, who had long provided technical material and critical access, soon found themselves ensnared in the FBI's dragnet. The ring that had once been so tightly knit was unraveling strand by strand. Inside FBI headquarters, the celebration was tempered with grim satisfaction. Walker's arrest was not just the capture of a spy, It was the closure of one of the darkest chapters in American counterintelligence. The Bureau understood the scale of the damage. For years, the Soviets had read U.S. naval traffic as if it were their own. Submarine patrols, fleet maneuvers, communication security, all had been compromised. Generations of sailors had operated under the false assumption of secrecy. The cost in strategic advantage was incalculable. And yet, the man at the center of it all seemed almost relieved as he was driven away in an FBI sedan. In interrogation rooms later, Walker spoke with a mix of bravado and resignation. He claimed he had done it for money, yes, but also hinted at deeper resentments, a sense of grievance against the Navy, against a country he felt had undervalued him. To the agents listening, it sounded like the hollow justifications of a man who had traded honor for greed. The Bureau's sting had been flawless. The surveillance teams, the timing, the coordination. It was the kind of operation counterintelligence officers dreamed of. And yet, beneath the satisfaction, a sobering reality lingered. They had stopped the leak, but only after years of hemorrhage. In the days that followed, headlines blazed across American newspapers. Navy officer accused of spying for Soviets. For the public, it was a shocking revelation. For those in the intelligence community, it was confirmation of their worst fears. If one man could compromise so much for so long, how many others might still be burrowed deep in the system? The net had closed, yes, but in the shadows of the Cold War, there were always more nets waiting to be sprung. Walker's arrest was both an end and a beginning, the downfall of one spy and the reminder of a battlefield that was far from finished. And so, in May 1985, under the watchful eyes of the FBI, John Walker's long dance with treason ended not in glory or secrecy, but in the hard steel of handcuffs, the glare of headlights, and the hollow silence of a man who realized too late that the game was over. The courtroom was not a battlefield of shadows, like the alleys of Vienna or the back streets of Moscow. There were no dead drops hidden in hollowed-out bolts or secret chalk marks scrawled on lampposts to guide KGB couriers. No, this battlefield was brighter, harsher, clinical. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators and journalists. The United States had captured one of the most destructive spies in its naval history, and now it intended to lay him bare before the law. John Anthony Walker Jr. sat at the defendant's table, his back straight, his expression defiant, yet strangely weary. He had lived nearly 2 decades with the thrill of being indispensable to the Soviets, the constant adrenaline of deception, the arrogance of believing himself untouchable. Now, stripped of that double life, he was reduced to a man in a cheap suit, shuffling papers, whispering to his lawyer. But even then, there was something unnerving about him, a trace of the cold steel that had enabled him to betray his own country with such calculated regularity. The trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. Every sailor who had ever sailed under the flag of the U.S. Navy, every family who had lost sleep during the height of the Cold War, every intelligence officer who had fought desperately to protect secrets. This was their day of judgment. What damage had Walker truly done? What lives had been lost or compromised because of the cipher keys he handed over to Moscow for cash-stuffed envelopes and Soviet promises? The courtroom would not only decide his fate, it would attempt to measure the immeasurable cost of betrayal. The charges were sweeping: conspiracy to commit espionage, multiple counts of delivering defense information to a foreign power, violations of the Espionage Act. Each one carried the weight of decades in prison. The government prosecutors were relentless, determined to present the ring not as a momentary lapse, but as a sprawling, methodical betrayal that stretched from Norfolk to San Diego, from submarine control rooms to the heart of Moscow's KGB headquarters. What made the proceedings uniquely venomous was the family element. Walker had not acted alone. He had dragged his blood into the mire. His brother Arthur Walker had been recruited, providing access to classified documents in the defense contracting world. His son, Michael Walker, had been used as a courier, moving classified material in and out of secure facilities with the nonchalance of youth corrupted by his father's manipulation. And then there was Jerry Whitworth, the Navy radio man and Walker's close associate, who had delivered an endless stream of cryptographic keys and technical manuals to keep the Soviets swimming in secrets. The FBI and the prosecutors built the story like a noose. First, they introduced Barbara Walker, John's estranged wife, who had been the one to finally tip the Bureau off. She walked to the witness stand, the eyes of the room fixed on her. She was not a spy, not a professional agent, just a woman who had endured years of psychological pressure and the quiet horror of knowing that her husband was selling out the country. Her voice shook as she described the nights John would leave mysteriously, the unexplained money, the secrets he would not share. She painted a portrait of a man who had not only betrayed his oath to the Navy, but had corroded the very foundation of his family. And then came the son. Michael Walker, young, nervous, carrying the burden of a surname now poisoned by treason. He had been caught, arrested, interrogated, and confronted with the mountain of evidence against him. In court, his testimony was a mixture of confession and explanation. He admitted to ferrying documents, to following his father's instructions. The prosecutors pressed. Did he understand what he was doing? Did he realize he was handing America's naval lifeblood to the Soviets? His answer, halting and raw, was that he had done it out of loyalty to his father, out of fear of disappointing him, out of the twisted sense of duty John Walker had instilled in him. The courtroom felt the weight of that tragedy, a father turning his own son into a pawn of espionage. Arthur Walker's trial was another theater of betrayal. The older brother, who had once worn the uniform with pride, now faced the ignominy of being exposed as a conspirator. Witness after witness traced the flow of classified material, the subtle ways Arthur had bent his position in defense, contracting to assist John's operations. When the guilty verdict was delivered, Arthur sat still, his face gray, as though the reality of what he had allowed himself to become had finally settled in. But the most damning trial of all was Jerry Whitworth's. Unlike Michael or Arthur, Whitworth had not been bound by blood. He had been bound by greed and a misplaced loyalty to John. He was the technical backbone of the ring, the man who supplied cryptographic keys, communication codes, and instructions that allowed the Soviets to read American naval traffic as if it were printed on an open bulletin board. Whitworth's trial drew heavy attention because it was through him that the full scale of the damage became clearer. Navy officers testified about the chilling consequences: Soviet submarines appearing in places they should not have known about, American maneuvers anticipated with uncanny precision, the balance of naval power skewed by the invisible hand of betrayal. As Whitworth listened, his composure faltered. Unlike John Walker, who seemed to revel in the attention and carried himself with an odd pride, Whitworth appeared haunted. He broke down during parts of the testimony, his face twisted in regret. The jury saw a man gnawed by guilt, a man who had sold his country's secrets for money and now could not bear the weight of what he had done. The prosecutors made their case with surgical precision. This was not a victimless crime. This was not just leaking documents. This was a spy ring that had endangered every sailor on every ship, every submarine patrolling the oceans. The Soviets had been handed the keys to America's naval communications kingdom, and it had not been for ideology, not for patriotism to another cause. It had been for cash. When the sentences came down, the courtroom trembled with the gravity of history. John Walker, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Arthur Walker, life imprisonment. Jerry Whitworth, 365 years in prison. A number so vast it was almost symbolic, a way of saying there would be no end, no reprieve, no return to daylight outside prison walls. Michael Walker, 25 years in prison, reduced in acknowledgement of his youth and cooperation. The Navy, meanwhile, conducted its own painful reckoning. Investigators traced the operational compromises, the instances where Soviet forces had moved with suspicious foresight, the technological edge that had mysteriously dulled. Officers testified that entire strategic doctrines had been undercut, that lives had likely been put at risk. Quietly, the Navy overhauled its communication security, recognizing that the cryptographic procedures it had trusted for decades had been an open book to Moscow. In the intelligence community, Walker's conviction became a grim case study. Training programs in the FBI, CIA, and NSA dissected his methods, his recruitment of family, his reliance on money rather than ideology. They examined how he had managed to operate for so long without detection, and how close the United States had come to being permanently crippled in naval warfare. Soon Walker's name joined the pantheon of traitors: Benedict Arnold, Aldrich Ames, Robert Hansen, as a reminder of the destruction one person could unleash. But beyond the technicalities and the doctrines, the human cost remained. A family destroyed. A son condemned to prison because of his father's manipulation. A wife haunted by the decision to finally speak up. A brother tainted forever. And a Navy that would never again take for granted the loyalty of its own. In prison, John Walker continued to show flashes of the arrogance that had defined him. He granted interviews, hinted at undisclosed secrets, tried to frame his treachery as a pragmatic act rather than a moral collapse. But behind the swagger was a man who would never see freedom again. A man whose name had become synonymous with betrayal. The courtroom drama had ended, but the echoes reverberated far beyond the 1980s. For the sailors who had once trusted in secure communications, for the intelligence officers who had fought to protect secrets, for the families shattered by espionage, the trials were not merely about punishment. They were about making visible the invisible war, the war of codes and secrets, of loyalty and betrayal that had raged silently beneath the surface of the Cold War. And in that war, John Walker had chosen his side. He had chosen Moscow. He had chosen money. He had chosen betrayal. And the United States had answered not with bullets or bombs, but with the weight of justice, the hammer of sentences so long they erased the possibility of redemption. The spy ring was broken. The trials were over. But the scars would remain, etched into the history of the Navy, the FBI, and the long shadow of the Cold War. The cell door clanged shut with the finality of history, and with it ended John Walker's 2-decade masquerade as a patriot in uniform. But outside those walls, in the Pentagon's hushed corridors, in the shadowed offices of Langley, and in the Kremlin's marble halls, the ripples of his betrayal were only beginning to spread. A spy's capture rarely ends the story. Often it begins a second, more sobering one, the reckoning. For the U.S. Navy, the Walker case was not merely an embarrassment. It was a trauma. The Navy had always prided itself on discipline, secrecy, and the sanctity of its communications. But when investigators laid out the scope of the damage, it became clear that the Soviet Union had for years been reading America's naval traffic almost in real time. Fleet movements, submarine patrol patterns, even the highly sensitive emergency action messages that could guide nuclear forces. Moscow had been granted an open window into it all. In the late 1980s, a classified report circulated among top admirals and the Secretary of Defense. It was chilling in its bluntness. The compromise enabled the Soviet Navy to anticipate U.S. submarine operations, evade detection, and counter American strategy with unprecedented accuracy. The report did not attempt to sugarcoat the consequences. Soviet submarines had often been exactly where American anti-submarine warfare units least expected them, and entire tactical doctrines had to be questioned in hindsight. Some Navy officers would later argue that Walker's espionage may have prolonged the life of Soviet submarine warfare far beyond what it otherwise would have been. The reforms began quickly, almost desperately. Communication security, ComSec procedures were overhauled. Cryptographic material, once handled with routines that had grown lax in their familiarity, was now subject to stricter controls, dual custody requirements, and accelerated rotation of keys. Training manuals were rewritten, not merely to explain technical procedures, but to instill an awareness that betrayal could come from within. Every sailor handling classified information was reminded, sometimes in haunting detail, of what one man's treachery had cost. Meanwhile, within the FBI and CIA, the Walker case became a permanent feature of counterintelligence training. New recruits were shown in stark terms how Walker had operated undetected for so long, how he had exploited family ties, how his motivations had been nakedly financial rather than ideological. Lecturers emphasized the signs that had been missed: the unexplained wealth, the sudden access to luxuries beyond a warrant officer's pay, the arrogance in Walker's behavior that some colleagues had found unsettling but never escalated. "If you see something, say something," became more than a slogan. It was born from the bitter knowledge that silence had allowed Walker to bleed secrets for almost 18 years. Inside Moscow, the reaction was more complicated, tinged with both pride and dread. For the KGB, Walker had been a golden stream of intelligence, a dream source whose reliability and access bordered on the surreal. Entire sections of the Soviet Navy's planning had been built on his information. Walker's code name within KGB files carried weight like few others. But when the news of his arrest reached Moscow in May 1985, there was panic behind the walls of the Lubyanka. Not only had they lost a treasure trove of American secrets, but they now faced the possibility that Walker, under pressure, might reveal details of KGB officers, tradecraft methods, or even double agents operating in the West. Archival fragments and later defectors would reveal that within the KGB's first chief directorate, a scramble began. Handlers were rotated out, operational files were sequestered, and instructions were sent to other assets in America to freeze activities until the scale of the damage could be assessed. Soviet generals, who had grown used to walking into Politburo briefings armed with uncanny insights into U.S. naval readiness, suddenly found themselves blind again. The Golden Stream had dried up overnight, and with it, one of Moscow's greatest espionage advantages. For the Americans, there was a bitter satisfaction in that, but it did not erase the cost already paid. At the Naval War College, professors wove the Walker case into lectures on strategy, pointing out instances where Soviet forces had maneuvered with suspicious prescience. War gamers replayed Cold War scenarios, inserting the assumption that the Soviets knew communications, and the results were sobering. Exercises that once ended in decisive U.S. victories turned muddled, stalemated, or worse. One particularly classified analysis in 1987 concluded that had war erupted in the North Atlantic during the late 1970s, U.S. anti-submarine forces would have been at a severe disadvantage because the Soviets, armed with Walker's codes, would have slipped their submarines into positions that American commanders never expected. This analysis circulated among the Joint Chiefs with a blunt warning: the Walker Compromise may have nullified key advantages of U.S. naval superiority for more than a decade. That sentence lingered in the minds of admirals like a ghost. It was one thing to catch a spy and lock him away. It was another to realize that his actions had altered the entire balance of naval power during the most dangerous years of the Cold War. At the FBI Academy in Quantico, instructors began using Walker's story as a morality play. Trainees were told in cinematic detail how Walker had recruited his son, his brother, and his friend, how he had poisoned those closest to him for the sake of envelopes of cash. They listened to tapes of Barbara Walker's calls, her voice trembling as she told agents about her husband's treachery. They read transcripts of Whitworth's testimony, soaked with guilt. And they were reminded again and again that espionage was not some abstract chess match. It was personal, it was devastating, and it could erupt inside the most ordinary families. There was also the matter of deterrence. The sentences handed down, life for John and Arthur Walker, 365 years for Whitworth, were not just punishments. They were warnings etched into the consciousness of every service member and intelligence officer. The message was unambiguous: Betray your country, and you will die in prison, forgotten by the world. Yet, as the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, a new complexity arose. The Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The world that John Walker had sold secrets to was dissolving before his eyes. And yet, the U.S. intelligence community did not relax. If anything, they doubled down. For they understood a hard truth. The end of one adversary does not end the possibility of betrayal. A spy sells not only to ideology, but to whoever is willing to buy. In that sense, Walker's ghost haunted the halls of intelligence into the 1990s. The Navy continued its reforms, tightening background checks, rotating cryptographic assignments more frequently, scrutinizing financial anomalies among its ranks. The FBI sharpened its counterintelligence training, emphasizing human factors as much as technical ones. And the CIA, battered by its own betrayals in the 1980s, folded the Walker case into its doctrine of mole hunting, teaching young officers that arrogance, greed, and overlooked red flags were often the most dangerous signals of all. Meanwhile, Moscow, no longer the Soviet Union but the Russian Federation, looked back at Walker as one of the jewels of its Cold War crown. Declassified KGB files in later years would show that he was considered among the most valuable American spies ever recruited. His arrest was seen as a crippling blow, a reminder that no source, no matter how reliable, was immune from exposure. But there was something else in those files, too. A quiet acknowledgement that without Walker, the Soviet Navy might have been blind and vulnerable in ways that could have changed the course of the Cold War. His betrayal had not just enriched Moscow with secrets, it had bought them time, confidence, and leverage in a superpower confrontation that had teetered on the edge of nuclear war more than once. In the final tally, the lessons of the Walker case were carved into the very marrow of U.S. counterintelligence. Trust, once blind, would never again be so naive. Cryptographic systems would never again be left in the hands of a single individual without layers of oversight. And the Navy, once complacent in its assumption of invulnerability, now carried the scar of humility. The Cold War was ending, yes, but the story of John Walker lingered like smoke after a fire, a warning carried into the New World Order. The greatest danger is not always across the ocean. Sometimes it wears your uniform, eats at your table, and calls you family. The echo of John Walker's betrayal did not end with his prison sentence or with the shuttered courtrooms where judges pronounced the weight of his crimes. The reverberations carried forward into a new century, into the DNA of U.S. intelligence culture itself, into the software of the Navy's security protocols, and into the whispered training sessions where counterintelligence officers drilled recruits with one example above all others, the Walker case. Even in the early 2000s, when the Cold War was supposed to be a relic and the Soviet Union just a shadow on the world map, Walker's ghost sat in the briefing rooms like an uninvited instructor. At the Naval Academy, at NSA training schools, at the FBI's Counterintelligence Directorate, the story of the man who traded keys for cash was presented not as a history lesson, but as a warning that betrayal was always closer than one dared to think. Young sailors watched slides of Walker's cipher cards, saw his family smiling in grainy photos, and were told in no uncertain terms that loyalty could fracture in ways no background check could fully catch. And yet, the damage Walker had caused was so vast, so systemic, that some still wondered if America had ever fully recovered. By the early 2000s, U.S. intelligence was in transformation. September 11th had thrown the apparatus into high alert, flooding resources into counterterrorism, building new agencies, and fusing old ones into unwieldy, sprawling bureaucracies. But beneath the hunt for jihadist cells and shadowy networks, the insider threat problem Walker embodied kept resurfacing. When Edward Snowden walked out of NSA facilities in 2013 carrying troves of classified files, analysts drew a straight line back to John Walker. The motivations were different, money versus ideology, But the method was the same. Someone trusted, someone inside, someone invisible, until it was too late. The Walker case had given Moscow a fire hose of secrets for nearly 2 decades. Snowden gave the world a glimpse into the surveillance state. Both had left the intelligence community reeling, asking whether the very people sworn to protect secrets were in fact the greatest danger to them. Walker's name was invoked in those debates like a curse. In closed-door hearings, admirals muttered that the Navy had already lived through its Snowden, back when the world thought the Soviets were 10 feet tall, because one man in uniform kept delivering them the codes to America's fleet. The FBI, which had once bungled early chances to catch Walker, built its modern counterintelligence doctrine on the scars of that failure. By the 2000s, agents training for surveillance and human source recruitment were forced to study how Walker had used family ties to expand his ring, how the Bureau had underestimated the ex-wife's tip, how long Whitworth's guilt festered before it broke. These lessons were not abstract. They shaped the tools agents carried into the hunt for modern moles like Ana Montes in the Defense Intelligence Agency and Robert Hanssen inside the FBI itself. Hanssen's capture in 2001 was hailed as the worst espionage case in FBI history, but older hands compared him to Walker, noting the same themes: greed, betrayal, the arrogance of believing one man could outsmart the entire American security system. Training modules paired the two cases as twin pillars of caution, one inside the Navy, one inside the Bureau, one feeding Moscow naval codes, the other feeding them counterintelligence operations. Together they formed the unholy textbook on how betrayal corrodes institutions from within. Inside the Navy, reforms were not cosmetic. After Walker, communication security was torn down and rebuilt. By the 2000s, encryption systems rotated on far tighter schedules. Physical access to cryptographic material was compartmentalized, and two-person integrity became sacrosanct. No sailor could handle certain codes alone. In the 2010s, as cyber became the new battlefield, these lessons were automated. Insider threat detection systems monitored keystrokes, flagged anomalous downloads, and tracked unusual behaviors. Where Walker could once stroll out of a comm center with a crypto card tucked in his briefcase, his modern equivalent would be pinged by an algorithm before leaving the parking lot. But the paranoia this produced was not entirely healthy. Sailors joked darkly that every email, every bathroom break was under suspicion. Commanders acknowledged that Walker's betrayal had forced the Navy to build walls so high that sometimes trust itself seemed like an antiquated luxury. Loyalty had to be measured in metrics, audited like an expense report. This cultural shift was perhaps Walker's truest legacy, the conversion of trust into a system of constant verification. Moscow, too, bore scars. In the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and its archives briefly cracked open, the sheer volume of intelligence Walker had provided stunned even seasoned observers. Former KGB officers admitted that Walker had been one of their golden streams, a font of U.S. naval communications that reshaped Soviet submarine doctrine. But in the 2000s, as Russia rebuilt under Vladimir Putin, the loss of Walker haunted them as well. He had been their ideal source, disciplined, greedy, and delivering material of continuous value. In Moscow's training academies, Walker's story was taught not just as a victory, but as a reminder of the fragility of sources. Recruit them, yes. Cultivate them, yes. But never assume they will not crack. Never assume family members will not betray them. Never assume the FBI's net will never close. Ironically, Walker's eventual capture had forced the Russians to adopt more careful tradecraft, to disperse their risks, to ensure that no single pipeline could cripple their collection if it collapsed. When American counterintelligence celebrated closing the ring, they did not realize they had taught their adversary how to build stronger ones. By the 2000s, the case seeped into popular culture too. Spy novels name-dropped Walker as shorthand for ultimate betrayal. Documentaries recycled footage of him in handcuffs, his face defiant and almost smug. Retired FBI agents went on lecture circuits, telling audiences how close America had come to catastrophe because of one man's greed. But for insiders, those still holding clearances, those still sitting in secure vaults, the story was less about drama and more about vigilance. When young recruits asked why they had to log every movement of a cryptographic key, why they were tested in endless drills, why their personal finances were scrutinized for anomalies, the answer came in 3 words: remember John Walker. His name had become a code in itself, a cipher meaning never again. And yet, whispers persisted. Could something like the Walker ring still happen? Technology had changed, oversight had hardened, but humans had not. Greed, resentment, ideology, they remained. In 2010, when Chelsea Manning leaked classified material, some Navy officers muttered that the ghost of Walker had returned in digital form. In 2013, Snowden's flight to Moscow felt like a cruel joke, as if the Kremlin had found another golden stream, only this time without having to pay. Each new breach, each new whistleblower or leaker, pulled Walker's shadow back into the light, reminding America that the insider threat could never be eradicated, only managed, only watched, and always too late. Walker himself lived long enough to watch part of this legacy unfold. From his prison cell, he granted interviews in which he insisted he had done no real harm, that he had merely balanced the world by leveling the playing field between superpowers. These words infuriated intelligence veterans. They saw them as the final insult of a man who had never understood or never cared about the sailors whose lives his betrayal had endangered. When Walker died in 2014, some obituaries treated him like a footnote, a relic of the Cold War. But inside the Navy, inside the FBI, the reaction was colder. A chapter had closed, yes, but the book remained open, its pages reread every time a clearance officer scanned a background check, every time a counterintelligence team built a new monitoring system, every time a young sailor was told that trust was both sacred and fragile. His death did not erase the betrayal. It cemented it. Today, nearly 4 decades after his arrest, the Walker case still lives in training rooms and classified briefings. It echoes in the algorithms designed to catch anomalies, in the security cultures built on suspicion, in the psychological profiles drawn to predict who might turn. It is invoked not with nostalgia, but with urgency, as if the lesson could fade if not constantly reinforced. In a world where cyber warfare and artificial intelligence dominate the headlines, the most feared scenario remains painfully old-fashioned. One insider, trusted and unnoticed, selling access for money. John Walker proved how devastating that scenario could be. His betrayal gave Moscow the keys to America's Navy. His legacy ensured that every generation of intelligence officers would be taught, again and again, how easily loyalty can fracture, how quickly secrets can vanish, and how deeply one man's greed can scar a nation. And so the story continues, not in the headlines, but in the routines of those sworn to protect secrets. Every secure door that requires 2 badges, every encrypted channel that times out after minutes, every flagged anomaly in a database. These are the monuments to Walker. Invisible, silent, but omnipresent. His betrayal has become architecture. His legacy is the paranoia that protects. And his name, whispered in classified halls, is still the cipher for what happens when trust dies in uniform. The story of John Anthony Walker does not end with a grave in a prison cemetery or with fading news clips that once labeled him the most damaging spy in U.S. Navy history. His story lingers because espionage never really ends. Secrets outlive their thieves, betrayals outlive their betrayers, and the shadows of one man's choices stretch across generations. Walker's life, from his first walk into the Soviet embassy with a cipher card tucked in his jacket, to his final days behind iron bars, forms a closed loop of greed, deception, and consequences. But the ripple of that loop extends outward, through the families destroyed, the sailors endangered, the intelligence systems rebuilt, and the doctrine reshaped. That is the real legacy, not just the secrets lost, but the permanent alteration of America's relationship with trust itself. When the ring was exposed in 1985, Americans gasped at the scale of it. Here was not some ideological defector or obscure clerk passing memos, but a career sailor, a warrant officer entrusted with the keys to the fleet. Here was a man who turned family into accomplices, who pulled his son and brother into a whirlpool of betrayal, who weaponized the bonds of blood for the profit of Moscow. That wound cut deep, deeper than technical losses or tactical setbacks. It showed that the enemy did not have to break into vaults or steal from satellites. They only had to buy loyalty from within. And when they did, the results could be catastrophic. The Soviets celebrated Walker's pipeline in secret, calling it a golden stream that watered their submarine fleets and silenced their fears about American codes. The U.S. Navy, in contrast, bled in silence, unable to measure how many maneuvers had been compromised, how many lives placed at risk, how much strategy undone by one man's greed. When the FBI's net finally closed, when the courtroom lights went dark, it seemed like the danger was contained. But intelligence veterans knew better. Walker was not just a spy. He was a symbol, and symbols do not die with handcuffs. In the decades that followed, his ghost was everywhere. In every security briefing, his name hovered like smoke. In every reform, his betrayal was the justification. In every warning about insider threats, Walker was the proof. Even Russia, the beneficiary of his treason, carried the lesson forward. Treasure your sources, but never rely too heavily on a single one. The FBI learned patience, paranoia, and persistence. The Navy learned that systems must be redesigned not once, but continually, because betrayal evolves just as fast as loyalty decays. By the time Walker died in 2014, the Cold War had been over for more than 2 decades. The Soviet Union that paid him no longer existed, but the machinery of espionage remained, and the cautionary tale of John Walker pulsed through it like a ghost current. In Snowden's leaks, analysts heard Walker's echo. In every background check tightened after a scandal, Walker's shadow moved. In every sailor who sat through a training film about insider threats, the lesson was clear. Betrayal is not history. It is a possibility, every day, with every clearance badge, with every human being who holds a secret. That is why his story endures. Not because John Walker was extraordinary, but because he was ordinary. A Navy man, a father, a husband, a co-worker. The kind of man no one would expect to sell out his nation. And yet, he did, methodically, relentlessly, for nearly 2 decades. His ordinariness is what makes him terrifying. Because if he could, anyone could. So when the last file is closed and the last lecture ends, the silence that follows is not comfort. It is vigilance. Somewhere, someone is watching, listening, considering, weighing greed against duty, resentment against loyalty. Somewhere, the cycle threatens to begin again. And in that moment, the ghost of John Walker steps out of the shadows, not to act, but to remind. The greatest threat to secrets is never the enemy outside. It is always the insider within. That is the epilogue of the John Walker spy ring, a betrayal that never ends, a lesson that must never be forgotten, a legacy that haunts America's intelligence community to this very day.